The Austrian War of Succession is an often overlooked existential conflict for the future of Europe. It was a war of opportunity and sexism. You see, in the decades before the war, Emperor Charles VI realized that he had an issue. He had no sons. This, at the time, was a huge issue. First, the Holy Roman Emperorship didn't allow female emperor. Second, and perhaps more pressingly, the Austrian Empire wasn't one state. It was a collection of crowns, kingdoms, duchies, and principalities. All of these had different election laws, which risked the Habsburg inheritance being divided upon his death. And third, even if Charles VI decreed that his daughter would succeed him, it would open the door to foreign candidates contesting the succession. So, Charles VI would spend the final decades of his rule consolidating support for his daughter, Maria Theresa, to succeed him. They ensured that the Holy Roman Emperorship would pass to Maria's husband while passing the Pragmatic Sanction, legalizing female rulers across the Habsburg domains. But those were the easy steps. Now he had to convince the other nations of Europe. He would support the Russians in a war over control of Poland, thereby securing Poland and Russia's blessing. France was offered the Duchy of Lorraine, and France and Spain accepted the succession too. Prussia simply agreed to respect the succession out of loyalty to the imperial throne. That only left two nations, Saxony and Bavaria, which didn't respect the succession. This was for a rather simple reason. In trying to secure better relations with the two states, Charles had married out his nieces to the two states. This was a big mistake, as this gave both states a very solid claim to the Habsburg inheritance. Charles, though, upon his death, had thought the succession to be secured. He was wrong. Immediately after Maria Theresa took power, all of Charles's efforts would prove futile. Prussia would swiftly invade the Duchy of Silesia, while France would back a Bavarian invasion of the empire. Before long, Spain also got involved by trying to regain Italian territory. Rarely before had the Habsburgs faced a crisis this serious. Not only had a war broken out, Charles had left the empire bankrupted, with a pathetic army. After all, he had spent all of his efforts and money on preventing exactly this conflict. There was no other way to put it. The Habsburgs were facing a war of extinction. In the first year of the war, Prussia would occupy Silesia, while the Bavarians would move to strike against the very important city of Prague, capital of the Kingdom of Bohemia. After doing so, Charles VII of Bavaria convinced all the 7 electors, 2 of which were now him, to declare him Holy Roman Emperor. This was a huge blow to Habsburg prestige, who had dominated the empire for 3 centuries. From here though, Austria would manage to recover. Maria Theresa had gone to Hungary and gained the full loyalty of the Hungarian nobles, which provided her with fresh soldiers. Militarily, the Austrians would manage to make a counteroffensive, but perhaps more importantly, the Austrians would make use of divisions between the aggressors. After successfully recovering the military situation, Prussia would temporarily leave the conflict, allowing Austria to defeat Saxony, while the war had by this point significantly expanded, directing France's focus away from Vienna onto London. The war would last for 5 more years, but the Habsburgs would survive, only losing Silesia and minor territories in Italy. All in all, an outcome that is far better than you might have expected for Maria Theresa. But what if this had changed? What if the anti-Austrian coalition had successfully defeated their enemies, vanquishing Maria's hopes at retaining her power? In those early years, it did seem very possible. The Austrians were outnumbered 3-1, while the Prussians were led by perhaps the greatest military mind of the time. I see basically 3 ways to improve the alliance's odds. First, the Bavarians preferred to march directly on Vienna, the capital of the Habsburg Empire, rather than Prague. Should this early push have indeed captured and secured the capital of the Habsburg Empire, while Prussia and Saxony push on Bohemia, the Austrians would be in a far weaker position. But This option also carried a great risk. It could mean that the Prussians could be the ones to capture Prague, which neither the Bavarians nor the French really wanted. So, to make this happen, we need the coalition to have far better cooperation and trust. They all had the same fundamental goal, the destruction of the Habsburg. Yet, the Bavarians had far greater claims than the Prussians themselves had. Considering radical other territorial gains beyond Silesia were impossible for Prussia, they would need other concessions. Considering Bavaria was planning to become the Holy Roman Emperor, the promised concessions are simple: prestige and a whole load of French and Bavarian gold. If these discussions are successful and the coalition acts more unified in politics and military, their success is already far more likely. Finally, the Austrians had a lot to thank to this man, von Khevenhülle. He, partially, was behind the impressive Austrian counteroffensives and invasion of Bavaria. Replace him with slightly worse generals for Austria, combined with our other proposed changes, and we have a real chance for the destruction of the Habsburg Empire. As Bavaria marches into the capital, Saxony and Prussia march into Prague, and the dispersed Austrian territories start falling too. Other nations, chiefly Britain and the Netherlands, would be panicking. But by the time that they might meaningfully intervene, the Austrians are practically already gone, making the intervention far more risky. The Austrians fail to reorganize, and they are forced to concede, ready to be partitioned. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. Now the peace deal, in my mind, would look something like this. France would push for the lowlands, and this would absolutely freak out the British. But their only continental ally has just collapsed, while France has never been stronger in Germany, and a full-scale war would now very much favor France, as I doubt that Prussia would mind gaining Hanover too. So, while tensions are high, Britain is forced to accept it for now. Spain attempts to gain control over Austria's Italian territories, likely at least gaining Milan back, a great step in Spain's attempted restoration of European power. Prussia then, of course, gained Silesia just like in our timeline. But they actually didn't gain all of it. Prussia, in this timeline, would gain slightly more here, and it is also possible that they negotiate further land gains, demanding the very defendable Sudeten Mountains of eastern Bohemia. Then, Saxony would have also desired territorial gains, most notably into Bohemia. This, however, is not something Bavaria, France, nor Prussia would really accept. Saxony is intentionally snubbed in terms of territory, though they are still handsomely rewarded for their participation in the war and their support for the new Bavarian emperor. Out of the remaining territories, we would see Bavaria gaining the Habsburgs' German holdings, way expanding their power as they take up their position as the head of the Holy Roman Empire. Now you may have noticed that the Habsburgs do remain somewhere: Hungary. Charles VI, in order to secure Hungary's support for his daughter's succession, changed their succession law. No longer would the crown simply pass to the king's heir, but instead the Hungarian nobles would elect their own king or queen. Thus, since the Hungarians elected Maria Theresa themselves, Bavaria has no claim to the territory. Of course, Bavaria would still see the kingdom as a threat to their rule and would desire to march in there to depose the Habsburgs completely. But neither France nor Prussia would actually support it. For Prussia, it is better to have Bavaria and Hungary continue to fight amongst each other, as this would mean that the emperor couldn't effectively counter Prussian expansionism. For France, the reason was rather similar. The competition between Bavaria and Hungary means that Bavaria needs France for their survival, making the emperor, essentially, a puppet of Paris. Supporting Bavaria's conquest of Hungary would essentially just mean that Austria has been renamed to Bavaria, with far more risk of Bavaria eventually taking arms against the French. divide and conquer is the name of the game. Now there are three big winners here. First is Prussia. With their world-class army and destruction of their primary rival, they are now in a much stronger position. Especially as Silesia was one of the most industrious and wealthy regions of the empire. Second is obviously Bavaria, but less so than the map may suggest. They have expanded a lot, but their new territories aren't necessarily immediately a benefit. You can expect the Bohemian nobles forcing an increase in autonomy, while the Austrian nobles do demand autonomy or at the very least monetary compensation. Considering the massive bribes that the Bavarians have had to pay to literally everyone, expect them to, in the short term, be a relatively bankrupt and ineffective state. Again, completely dependent on the French for survival. Which leads us to the biggest victor of them all, the French. They have destroyed their eastern rival, replacing it with a puppet emperor. They have gained the southern lowlands, putting serious pressure on the British. And beyond that, their ally of Spain is consolidating Italy. Things are looking good. But if you know this period from our own history, you know the major war that is coming next, which in our timeline was known as the 7 Years' War. British-French rivalries, the main cause of the war, has not changed, and in fact have even gotten worse with the French annexation of Belgium. But the alliances are just slightly different to our timeline. While France would initially be allied to both Bavaria and Prussia, this likely wouldn't last. Considering France's loyalty would mainly lie with Bavaria, a British-Prussian alliance still seemed likely. For Prussia, it gave them access to massive British subsidies, as well as even further potential for expansion. For the British, it kept Hanover safe from a French invasion. Most interestingly though, both Britain and Prussia might gain an alliance with Hungary. For Britain, Hungary is the key to destroying France's Bavarian project. For Prussia, supporting the Habsburgs could mean them accepting the loss of Silesia, while the restored Habsburgs would again be weaker, providing yet more opportunities for Prussia in northern Germany. If you compare the map of the war in this timeline to the one in ours, one thing should become very clear. The French alliance is actually significantly weaker in this timeline. Much like in ours, the war starts between France and Britain in North America, before then spreading into Europe. I see two ways for that to happen. First, Bavaria could get invaded by the Hungarians, striking their east. Swiftly after, the Prussians jump in too. Alternatively, and perhaps more likely, we could see Prussia do something similar to our timeline. They invade and occupy Saxony. Now Bavaria, as the emperor, has a choice to make. Let Prussia get away with it, strengthening your rival and completely ruining your reputation as the emperor, or take the bait and start the war in Europe. Either way, the Bavarians would soon be overrun by coalition forces. Within Bohemia, the nobles swiftly change to the winning team, something soon repeated by the Austrian nobles. Russia would enter the war too, panicked about Prussia's swift expansion, but they would fail to put enough pressure in the short term to prevent the collapse of Bavaria. As Bavaria surrenders, the Anglo-Prussian alliance has achieved a great victory. Now of course, this might all seem very extreme, but remember, Frederick II was leader of Prussia at this time. The same Frederick which in this war in our timeline held off a united Austria, Russia, Sweden, France, all largely alone, while Britain was focused on a blockade of France and the colonial war. There is no doubt that Frederick and Maria Theresa together wiped the floor with Bavaria. Now with the southern front basically taken care of, Prussia turns around to deal with the Russian and Swedish invasions, where Prussia secures their borders too. The Continental War soon grinds to a stalemate, but due to the British Navy, a stalemate that greatly favors the Prussians. In North America, the British eventually devastate the French, and in India too, the French are evicted from their holdings. But it gets worse, as France cannot just go on a rampage themselves. First, because it's unlikely to actually succeed, but also because the Dutch likely joined this conflict. They had remained neutral in our timeline, but the French conquest of the southern lowlands is not something I imagine that they could ever accept. With France already looking weak, the Dutch and the British put pressure on northern France. Soon, France and allies realize they must surrender. In the colonies, the outcome is the same as in our timeline, with practically the entire French colonial empire destroyed. European peace, though, is far more interesting. The Dutch could take charge of much of Belgium, securing the line against the French. While a defeat for France overall, they do keep the Duchy of Luxembourg, leaving them larger than they were in our timeline. Obviously though, Bavaria has it far, far worse. Their short stint as a European great power is swiftly and decisively dashed. The Austrians regain their former territories in Bohemia and Austria, though it is possible that Bavaria keeps the minor Swabian territory. They were disconnected and relatively unimportant to the Habsburgs. If Bavaria surrendered swiftly, they might keep them as a small gesture of goodwill. I also don't expect Austria to annex much Bavarian territory for the simple reason that Prussia would threaten to stop supporting them, which might risk the Habsburgs' overall victory. The Prussians would then consolidate control over Saxony, either directly or indirectly, ensuring another great expansion of their power and a much better geographic position if competition with the Habsburgs does play up again. By now, Prussia would have half the population of Austria, a huge improvement from the balance in our timeline. Oh yeah, and Prussia would also try to annex Swedish Pomerania. With that, the peace deal is concluded, and Europe is fundamentally changed. The Habsburgs regained their title as Holy Roman Emperor, and officially, they returned to the forefront of Holy Roman politics. In practice though, it is not that simple. The Hungarians played a huge role in the restoration of Habsburg power. Expect them to now get massive privileges, like exclusion from taxes, exclusion from being levied to the imperial army, and a reduction in general imperial power in Hungarian lands. Potentially, the Hungarians demand an expansion of their core territory too. Other nobles would similarly try to make demands of the Habsburg, with the Bohemians potentially forcing greater autonomy too. These things are significant. Even in our timeline, Austria at the time was backwards compared to their rival. This would be even more true now. They have twice the population of Prussia, but Prussia is able to much more effectively make use of their population, with their far more efficient and modern state and army. In practice, it would no longer be a contest. Prussia has, a century earlier than in our timeline, become the dominant one out of the German powers. Frederick's efforts have paid off in a way that even he could not have imagined. Ironically enough, this could actually mean an Austro-Prussian alliance in the future. This weakened Austria has to worry about the French encroaching on the West, a Bavaria that still dreams of recovering their territories, the Spanish consolidating Italy, and by this time still, the Ottoman threat on Hungary. Should Austria decide to be hostile to Prussia in an effort to reverse their losses there, we could see the alliances reversing yet again, with Prussia once more joining Bavaria and France against Britain and Austria, in yet another, potentially existential war for Austria. In my opinion, an uneasy Austro-Prussian alliance is more likely to counter France as well as rapid Russian expansionism. By this point though, the scenario has gone on for so long that everything has fundamentally changed. Thus, take the rest of this video with a big grain of salt, as, for the sakes of saying anything besides, I don't know, we will follow our own history to a certain extent. So let's assume that something like the first Polish partition of our timeline still happens before our attention returns to France. Across the Atlantic, the Americans would still rise up against their British overlord. Much like in our timeline, the French, upset about their recent loss, see in America an opportunity to punish the British and bankrupt themselves for the United States they're independent. You know what that means? Revolution. While there is no guarantee that Napoleon does rise to power, we also haven't done anything to explicitly prevent him. Besides, this video is long enough. We don't really have time to explore the fundamental changes in the timeline from removing Napoleon. But what we can do is explore a potential different map after an alternate defeat of Napoleon. Now first, Spain is still present in Italy, though they are greatly weakened. I would expect Milan to be taken away from them, while they might instead gain control over Tuscany or pass it over to Naples, which was controlled by a Spanish family member. Sardinia-Piedmont could come out of the war even stronger, while Austria still annexes Venice. Compared to our timeline, Austrian influence in Italy is greatly reduced. In the lowlands then, the Dutch are still expanded south. Unlike our timeline, France keeps Luxembourg, assuming that the allied position of France is the same as in our timeline, a restoration of the pre-revolution border. This would be a great boost to French power going forward. Besides some minor changes, France would keep the territory. This could also mean that the Dutch would be in a better position to prevent the Belgian Revolution. First, because they have controlled the territory for longer, and second, because there are less Belgians to actually revolt. Most importantly though, Prussia, being far bigger, likely played a far bigger role in the defeat of Napoleon. With Russia demanding expansion into Poland, Prussia is forced to look elsewhere. With Saxony already secured and an expansion into the Rhineland guaranteed, Prussia would seek more concessions. While British Hanover would likely be off limits, Prussia could expand into Mecklenburg, or perhaps they annex more of the smaller states, potentially connecting their territories far better. Then we have the matter of the German Confederation. Should it get established, or something like it, we'd see Prussia and Austria take up far more equal roles, rather than a continuation of Austria's traditional domination like in our timeline. Finally then, Bavaria might be strengthened too. With their increased control over southern Germany, they might not even be expanded north like in our timeline, with instead their position in the south being secured. Considering the threat from Prussia and France, we might even see both occur, as Austria and Bavaria seek to counter Prussian hegemony over Germany. Of course, this map is completely hypothetical, but the changes to this world would be immense. We have a far stronger Prussia, a weaker and more decentralized Austria, and a more powerful Sardinia and Italy, while Spanish Tuscany might become an issue in the future. The French annexation of Luxembourg shouldn't be understated, as it could prove crucial in the future, as it affords the French their own massive coal deposits, potentially increasing French industry substantially. Meanwhile, assuming the Dutch do remain neutral, French Luxembourg would mean the geography for any future Franco-German conflict is completely different, as the front lines would be far larger. But with this map, I will overturn the scenario to you guys. What do you think happens next? Or do you think the Napoleonic Wars would be substantially changed in the first place? For now though, this is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching, and consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing. If you've enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, then I'm sure that the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.